Steve Emmottól talán megtudhatjuk azt, hogy ők hogyan látják a zöld politika szerepét és a zöld politikai jövőjét, illetve ennek megújítását az Európai Unióban.
What you've just heard from Peter talking about a change of paradigm, a potential response to that, and the challenge really, are we ready for it? Because the world is changing, there is no doubt about that. Europe's position in the world is changing, and I'm not sure that many people have woken up to that. And what I'd like to do is to tell you a little bit about the way in which the Greens operate, the Green family operates. I'd like to talk about democracy. It's a subject which I think is relevant here in Hungary, but it's relevant throughout the EU. And I'd like to talk about the crises which you referred to, but I have a longer list of crises, and they're all interlinked, and they all relate to the ecological perspective, and they're all part of that same challenge. And one of the problems in which we find ourselves is that all the crises are being dealt with in separate categories, and there is no interconnection between them, and no creative thinking which is taking us beyond the old paradigm, beyond the old grey thinking. And Europe and the European structures are very happily stuck in those old structures, and it's dependent on people like the Greens to shake that hierarchy and to shake that cosy but unproductive political structure. So, for this election, the challenge that the Greens have set themselves is to try and explain how we should renew Europe, how we should change Europe, what sort of Europe we should have, not this Europe, but a different and a better Europe. And all the political families are saying the same thing, because they all understand that we're in a mess and they don't quite know where to go to get out of it. But the Greens, I think, have got a more coherent set of responses, and I'll try and give you some idea of what those are. First of all, a little bit about the Green group in the European Parliament, where all the MEPs sit. It's, at the moment, the fourth largest group in the Parliament, after the Christian Democrats, the Socialists and the Liberals. It's possible, when the results come out of these elections, that we will slip a little bit down that ranking, because other groups might be larger. But the significant thing about the Green group is that it's very coherent and very cohesive. It tends to vote together, it tends to create its policy positions and stick to them in a way which other political families don't, because they are a much looser political set of affiliations. And so in boxing terms, the Greens fight above their weight. They make more noise than they're entitled to do from their numbers. They demand more action from the Parliament. They embarrass and shame and ridicule the other political groups into taking action when they would prefer to be comfortably sitting there doing nothing. Every Green MEP that you elect helps that effort, and every Green MEP arrives in Brussels with a degree of expertise which many politicians don't have, because Greens are campaigners, Greens come from NGO-type backgrounds, Greens understand what needs doing, and they've got the passion to do it. So there is a level of expertise amongst Green MEPs which is reluctantly acknowledged by the other parties. We speak on energy, they listen to us. We speak on data protection, they listen to us. We speak on climate change, they listen to us, because our MEPs are actually in there and know what they're talking about. They're not just responding to somebody else's brief. And the same applies to the staff who work for them. I worked for the Green Group for a while as an advisor on genetic engineering and then again on trade. And I was amazed to discover just how much knowledge and competence there is amongst the staff. These are not bureaucrats. These are not civil servants. These are activists. And they put their knowledge to work in this political sphere. So the Green Group is unique in that sense. The Green Group has got a value inside the Parliament, which is not matched by any of the other groups. And although I say that as a Green, I think if you ask the other groups privately, they would probably acknowledge that this was true. I would like now just to have a short evaluation of what I see, or what I think we all see is wrong with the current European Union construction, which is that although the European Parliament is a directly elected democratic forum, and although since the Treaty of Lisbon it has more powers than it ever did, there is still something wrong with the system. There is still a democratic deficit. And I know you have your problems with democracy here in Hungary. You can repeat that in various other countries throughout the EU. You're not alone in that situation. But at the top, in the EU structures, we have, maybe not the same, but we have an equivalent democratic corruption. We have a system where corporate lobbyists are able to write laws, not the politicians, not the MEPs, but these laws are written, drafted by corporate lawyers, by lobbyists. Now, I'm not against lobbies, and I accept that there is a need for everyone to be able to express their opinion and make their demands on the elected representatives, on the MEPs. But it becomes corrupt at the point at which those MEPs are not permitted the freedom, are not allowed to legislate as they choose, but are in fact manipulated, bullied and badgered and supported by these industrial lobbyists. You could say the same applies to the civil society lobbyists, because of course NGOs go there also trying to influence MEPs. But in a sense, they are not seeking to do this behind closed doors, nor are they making a secret of their agenda, which often is the case with the industrial lobbyists. So we've got a corruption cronyist deficit there, which is very hard to get to the bottom of. It requires much more serious action than just simply a voluntary register of lobbyists, which is what we have at the moment. So if you add to that tax evasion, which is depriving the European Union of, well, the figures vary between 1 trillion and 3 trillion euros a year in lost revenue. If you start to understand the way in which the Commission is subservient to the Council of Ministers, bypassing the Parliament, we've got a structure which is not fit for purpose. And it's the Parliament's responsibility to try and do something about that. And the Parliament is trying to do something about that. I don't know if any of you have been following the series of debates which are being held by the leading candidates of each of the main political families. There was a big debate in Brussels last night, which was televised, as I said earlier. I'm not sure it was shown here. But basically, building on a provision in the Lisbon Treaty, the Parliament has determined that the next President of the European Commission should be chosen, and it has to be chosen by the parliamentarians on the recommendation of the ministers, should be chosen from the lead candidates of the main political parties, which means that the 5 people who stood up there, Ska Keller for the Greens, Alex Tsipras for the European left, Martin Schulz for the Socialists, Jean-Pierre Juncker for the Christian Democrats, and Guy Verhofstadt for the Liberals. One of them expects to be named as the next EU Commission President. Now, I'm not sure that's going to happen, because that's not the perspective that the Council of Ministers has. The Council of Ministers thinks something else might happen, and we're back to your paradigm shift again. The Council of Ministers thinks that they will be able to do a deal behind closed doors, as they've always done, and present a compromise candidate to the Parliament, and then hope that Parliament will not be brave enough or strong enough to vote it down. And there is a very, very, very strong chance that we're going to have a huge power struggle in Brussels after the European election. A, because the opinion polls suggest that the Christian Democrats and the Socialists, the two obvious candidates for lead roles, are going to get more or less an equivalent number of votes, perhaps 20 or 30 votes between them difference. And so the other groups, the Liberals, the Greens, the European left, and to an extent the European Eurosceptic parties, are going to hold the balance of power. And it's going to be an extremely interesting contest to see whether this produces a revolution or whether we go back to doing things the old way and we look under the table and we decide, well, the lowest common denominator wins, which is what happened last time and what happened the time before. So there is a very real democratic power struggle in prospect. It might not sound that exciting to those of you who are not sort of sitting on the edge of your seats in Brussels, but it's really very important because it's going to determine the future shape of the European Union. And it's really significant to know who is going to come out of that on top and what influence parties like the Greens will be able to bring to bear in that process. That takes me on to probably the transatlantic trade negotiations, just to pick one issue out of many. I know it's a subject of interest here. TTIP, as it's called, is basically a mega trade deal between the EU and the US. Its merit from the point of view of the top trade negotiators is that it is hoped to unlock what at the moment are locked, because normal trade, shipping goods and services backwards and forwards between EU and the US, happens pretty well without any problems. The tariffs are very low between the two trading blocs. There are not many obstacles to physical trade, but there are many, many, many obstacles to trade in terms of the values, the standards, the environmental protection, the social protection, and so on that we apply here, much to the annoyance of mainly American companies, but also some European companies. And so TTIP is in fact an attack on the European standards, the European way of life, the European Parliament's ability to legislate, to regulate, to determine what is in our common good, not what is in the interests of the corporate lobbyists. And if you add to that a provision which requires, would provide companies with the ability to take governments to court to sue them if they didn't like laws which have been passed, you've got a recipe for what I regard as a disastrous conflict. The Greens are opposed to this deal in that form. It's not to say we shouldn't trade with the US, it's clearly we should, but the Greens want to see this document torn up and a different document put in place. This is going to be one of the defining battles, I believe, of the next 5 years inside the European Parliament. And again, it hinges largely on the flavour and the shape of the majorities which are formed inside the Parliament. There's a TV series in the UK called Game of Thrones. I don't know if that shows in Hungary or not. It's a rather weird, almost surreal, medieval game show, for want of a better description. But it's about power struggles between various clans. And that's what's going on now. We've got a Game of Thrones in Brussels, because it's not just the appointment of the European Commission President, it's also the appointment of the European Council President, the European Parliament President, the High Representative for Foreign Affairs, the head of NATO, and various other posts. So there is a real game of thrones going on, and these negotiations I talked about earlier will involve much more than the Commission. That's probably far too much that you wanted to hear about the boring political process in Brussels. It is important, but it's pretty hard to engage the public in that, and it's pretty hard to explain why this should be exciting. But it really is a power game which affects everybody in due course. The real issues, we talked about the crises that we've been facing, and they're interlinked. Not only do we have a democratic deficit, we have an economic and financial crises which are not yet resolved, although hopefully we are in a less worse state than we were. We have a climate crisis which is hanging over our heads and about which we are doing almost nothing. We have an energy crisis because we're dependent on sources of energy, including Russian gas and oil, which are not sustainable and which are politically dangerous. We have an environmental crisis because we're losing biodiversity at a rate which we can't afford. We have an unemployment and a social crisis, particularly amongst the youth, where a whole generation is at risk of not finding work. And all of these crises in some ways are interlinked. So if you pull out one thread from any of those, you'll find that it's connected to the others too. And these are not being dealt with in anything like a creative manner. You called again for new thinking, for creative thinking. These crises are being dealt with in a mechanical and unthinking way. They're being done in compartments. So the climate directorate of the European Commission doesn't control the energy policy. It doesn't control the industrial policy. It doesn't relate to anything. It's operating in a vacuum. And it's no surprise that the EU climate policy is in a complete shambles. And in Paris in November 2015, we are building up towards another climate summit, as we hoped we would have had in Copenhagen a few years ago, in which we want the European Union to play a defining and clear role. And unless the Commission really gets a grip on its policy and positioning and integrates this into its overall structure, we are going to end up short again. Now, this is not my problem, because I'll be long dead by the time 4 degrees of warming arrives, but my grandchildren will have to live with that, and I feel responsible for them. I feel that we owe them a lot more than we're doing now. This is something, again, on which Greens have been campaigning and will continue to campaign, but it's something which ought to be top of the agenda and which slips further and further away under the current regime. If we change the Commission, if we change the Parliament, if we have a more creative and interactive political process there, we still can do something about it. And just finally, I'd like to say something about the position of the Hungarian Green MEPs that we hope to welcome in Brussels. Because up until now, the Green Party has been lacking in representation from what you might call Eastern Europe or New Europe. And this has, in some ways, led us into a similar trap to other parties, which is that we're perhaps a bit too northern, and we're perhaps a bit too western, and we're perhaps a bit too old Europe. And we do need new thinking. We do need to hear the perspective from Central and Eastern Europe. We hope to have a Croatian MEP as well, which will be a great breakthrough for the newest EU member state. That will refresh, we hope, the Green family in Brussels, and will give a new impetus to the Green Party and the Green Group in the European Parliament. So we're excited. We think we're going to make some progress. We'll probably have some setbacks as well, but we think that this is a fresh start, an opportunity for us to try and demand a different Europe, a new Europe, and we hope that you will support us in that. Thank you very much.